How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Tell me about this room you're in, first of all.
Oh, this is my office. So it's
It looks
just
like there's a lot of books.
yeah, I've got about half my books in here. So yeah.
Wow. Looks like a library.
Yeah, that's what I've always wanted. So we built it into the basement of our house.
Nice. Okay. I'm interested in the art of the possible, by which I mean, how do you go about creating possibilities? How do you create possibilities in your life? What do you believe the art of the possible is? What is it to you? How do you create that? How do you create possibilities in your life or your custom for your customers? I know you're like maybe you would describe your field as innovation. What is innovation and how does that relate to possibility? How do you think about possibility? It's very much casual conversation.
Okay.
Um, you can relax. My goal is to help people discover what their best next step is in their life. I have a lot of thoughts. I'm sure I will contribute, but I think what would be most interesting is anything that we can do to help people get better at uncovering those possibilities for themselves. We're both in our basements. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything. What's a good way to introduce you, Kes?
So innovation leader, innovation executive, whichever you feel more comfortable with. Happy with either.
Hi, I'm Dave Gray, founder of the School of the Possible, where we're exploring a new approach to learning. Most schools focus on teaching existing facts. In the School of the Possible, we focus on possible facts, things that do not yet exist, but could be so. The school is about creating the future, but it is rooted in the present. No matter who you are or where you are, there is a best next step for you. A step that you can take, a step toward a better, more fulfilling, more meaningful life and work, a step toward a better world. That's the art of the possible, the art of the best next step. And it starts now. Welcome to the Art of the Possible. I'm your host, Dave Gray, and today my guest is Kes Sampanthar. He is a thought leader and consultant who works with executives and leaders in large companies to help them discover their best next step, to help them open up possibilities. He's graciously agreed to be with us today to talk about the art of the possible. Welcome.
It's great to be here, Dave.
It's great to have you. I have a couple of things that I'd like to hit with you. One is just generally the art of the possible, how you think about possibility, how you open up possibilities for yourselves and your client. And then maybe we could also geek out a little bit about visual frameworks because I know that you use them a lot in your work, use them to think about possibilities, use them to explore different frameworks and or ways of putting information together and sharing it. So I think that would be an interesting topic as well. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, excited for this conversation. I
Yeah.
love the idea of art of the possible.
So when I say art of the possible, what does that conjure for you? How do you think about that? If I were to say you're an artist of the possible, what's your canvas? What are your paints? What's your toolkit? How do you go about that?
So to me, the art of the possible is working on things, inventing things, helping the world move forward, exploring the possibility space, things which have never been, things which are changing. That sort of feeling has always excited me. I like the idea of the new. As I've matured, I lean towards things which I believe are going to create positive outcomes in the universe, the world. So I do push for that. But at some level, I get a lot out of just exploring that cave face, that sort of pioneering, that like breaking through and opening a door into something which never existed before. What are
Yeah.
my paints, canvases, my tools?
Yeah. How do
Honestly,
you do
like
it?
I started off AI researcher, very computing based. What I liked even back then, 30 years ago, looking at neural networks, is exploring ideas. Because everything for me starts off with an idea. This is why I read a lot. Loved a lot of your books and been a huge fan for many years. Books which spark an idea, spark a question, spark something which helps me understand one aspect of the world in a deeper way. My canvas is the canvas of ideas. Herman Hesse has this idea of the glass bead game, where these people like think about ideas, collide them together, create new things. I've been fascinated with idea creation. One of the first things that I sold was this creativity game. I would look at my bookshelves. They were much smaller back then when I was younger, but I would look at the things I'd read and I would never organize them because I liked the random collision of ideas. And
Mm.
I'd sit there and look because when I'm trying to solve a problem, I would look at these connections. And then I realized when I became a consultant, I'd be on the road. So I was like, how do I bring my library with me? So I started writing them on index cards. And that turned into creating, I was like, what happens if I could create a game out of this? So I started collecting this idea library, which I put on cards, turned it into a game. I studied game design. Back in the day, I was a digital game designer, but then I had to learn a board game design, which was actually much harder because it's a second order design challenge.
Mm.
And created this game called MetaMemes. It's a board game that eventually had to throw away the board. So it turned into a card, and the card game worked much better. So to me, like my tools are ideas. I've always loved card decks. I've got mine back there. I've always created cards because they allowed me to manipulate ideas, connect them in ways, look at them in a different sort of space, which I've always enjoyed. So whether it's looking at my bookshelves, whether it's translating them in cards, whether it's connecting ideas, that's my tools, but my canvas has always been mental.
Okay, so let's dive into that. Let's say you imagine you reading a book, okay? Do you have a stack of index cards beside you? Are you making notes on index cards, or is there a way that you like to collect your thoughts so you can reference them later? Is there a way you take notes? Do you underline? Do you dog your pages? How do you go about tending your idea garden?
It has changed a lot over the years.
Uh,
I've tried multiple different methods. I definitely do not jump to index cards straight away. I've tried every different kind of post-it note, marginalia. I use a book to think inside. So I use the covers, the margins, the write things. I found these little post-it note tabs so I can actually write the ideas on. Some of my books have these tabs in them. And in general, when I'm reading a book, I'm just capturing my thoughts and ideas. So I've tried systematically doing it. I used to write down the page number and the idea at the back on the back cover. I've tried putting post-it notes in. But honestly, the more I learn about the brain, I've learned that as long as I engage with the material and think, and that involves writing in my case, I remember I put them into my brain. I was actually quite surprised. I left university. I was like, I'm going to read for fun. I'm
mhm.
not going to read and test myself. And that feeling is like you finish a book and somebody goes, oh, what was it about? And it's like, oh, at the high levels, like, all right, what things did you take away from it? And I'll be like, yeah, I'm not sure. And the fascinating thing was ideas were floating in my head. I've also got an incubation process, which is a way of bubbling those up. But what I realized was it was about, I don't know, it was like 10 years ago, I was working on something and these ideas came to me and I was like, hang on a minute, I don't know where they came from. And I went back and I dug through all these things. It was actually in a Kindle because I played with the early Kindles. And it was a book I'd forgotten about, but I knew the information from. I knew the story, I knew the data point, I knew that. And I was like, hang on a minute, that went in without me having to do anything. So just realizing how my unconscious brain works, how input information comes in. And like I said, I've had this sort of incubation question storming process, which is a way of bubbling up and working with my unconscious mind, which I realize that process is probably more important than note taking. So as much as I still marginalia, I index ideas, there's books which I've read multiple times soon after each other, and each time I have different kinds of ideas which come out of it. So it's just a case of interacting with books, which is what I enjoy the most.
Can you tell us a little bit about this work you do with your unconscious mind, this incubation process or bubbling up? What is that? Can you talk about that a little bit? It sounds interesting.
Sure. I'll tell you a little story and where it started. I was in a think tank. I was doing sort of data science programming, and they put four of us into this room. We were all graduates, young, wet behind the ears, and we were working on this large multi-dimensional database system, which this lead architect had invented. And so whenever we came across a problem, we had to go and talk to Roger, who's the chief architect. And lovely guy, white beard, really big thinker. You'd go and stand in front of me, 20-year-old kid, and you'd turn around and he'll just start peppering you with questions. Like, all right, well, define the problem. All right, let me, like, you'll spend like 20 minutes defining the problem. And then there was this sort of click moment. And then he would just go into this, what it felt like a roller coaster. You were on it for the ride. Like he goes to the guts of the system and all of this stuff. And you're standing there and you're taking all this information in, and then you realize you've solved your own problem. He hasn't answered your question, but you've solved it yourself. So what we started doing as a little team was we would do it for each other. So it's like, all right, you play Roger, I've got to, and then ask the questions, raise the eyebrow, rub your beard, pretend beard, it's kind of a fun thing. And you realize that you solved the problem. So I was sat there I was working over the Christmas holidays.
And what was something about it was that it was a role play, but something about it was like about the kinds of questions that Roger would ask.
Yeah, so frame the problem, right? So basically like framing out the problem. So I was working over this Christmas break, trying to get a deliverable done, and nobody's around. Everybody's doing stuff. I'm sitting in the office by myself, and I'm like, I'm stuck. So I was like, okay, I can't talk to anybody. Roger's not here. And I was like, all right, I've got my notebook. Let me just role play with the notebook. And so I started writing and just writing down the questions the same way Roger would ask, and playing both sides of the chess game, as it were. And then the solution came to me again. You solve it by going through this. So it turned into a process I call thinking with a pencil. And now I call it question storming or question jamming, which is, I realized that to be able to look through a problem space in the right way was to ask questions. But here's where things got interesting. As I started researching how incubation worked, when I stumbled across the idea of incubation, I read about Henri Poincaré and like this idea of, I was working on a math puzzle, went away on this sort of field trip, was stepping onto the bus, and the idea came to him. So this idea that your brain's processing things, so that fascinated me. And I was like, hang on a minute, this question storming, what happens if I put the questions in but didn't answer them? So I started like in the evenings just writing down the questions I had and then going to bed. I read, like Hemingway, things like different books, and like a lot of people kept on talking about this idea. And so I'd write the questions down, and in the morning I'd revisit them. And
that's so interesting. I do exactly the same thing. Every night, even if I don't have a question, I'll write down a topic or something I want to explore, and then first thing in the morning, before I do anything else, I'll just free flow stream of consciousness.
That's what I mean about tapping into the unconscious, because I realized that questions are like an API for the brain. Application programming interface. It's your brain, you put a question in, and your brain doesn't like information gaps, so it tries to resolve it. It tries to find it. Like, to the point is, if you give it an answer, it'll go, all right, I'm done, we're good, and it'll stop thinking about it. So this idea of forcing, even if you come up with one idea, come up with 100. So then it has to deal with like, all right, which one of these is better? Like forcing it so it never feels like it closes that information gap. And that's what I mean about processing information. So I've been doing this practice consistently since I think like 2004.
Wow.
That's when I started reading. So when I created that game, that creativity game, MetaMemes, I did it as a sort of early adopter release. It was for game designers because I was testing out the idea. I called it a purple cow release, an early adopter release, and it sold out to businesses. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute. I wasn't ready to do the business version of it, but that was the idea. So I went back to these businesses and asked them, and they were like, so we really like this. Can you make this more business focused? And can you give us a process? So that's when I started digging up all the innovations research and process and going back to Wallace and Henri Poincaré and Jacques Hadamard and did all of that. And that's when I came up and I was like, hang on a minute, this is incubation. That's a really interesting thing. And then I looked at some of the neuroscience of cognitive, and then that's when I was like, hang on a minute, there's a process. And it feels weird because like I've always done better. I don't do well staying up through the night, like working on a puzzle. Like I remember having to finish a project right before the finals at computer science, and the lab was full at 10:30 at night, and everything had to be in by 8 a.m. in the morning. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to bed. I'm exhausted anyway. I'll come in at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was a handful of people still sleeping on the keyboards, and I buzzed through the problem, and I was ready to hand in the thing. But it always feels a little scary that you've got this deliverable the next day, and you go, I'm going to go to bed instead of actually work on it. But that's what I mean about processing. My incubation process, my thinking with a pencil, my question storming.
A bunch of things are bubbling up for me based on what you're saying. One is the language of the unconscious. It isn't necessarily speak in words. At least I've noticed. Sometimes you get symbols or images or metaphors. What kind of things? What have you noticed about the way things bubble up in your dreams or your early waking thoughts?
So they're normally feelings. So I've been talking a little about the impressions. So I always talk about when I'm working on a big, like I'm trying to make a breakthrough in a particular area, and I've jammed a whole bunch of stuff in. I'm doing this question storming, and this can take weeks, months, and then I wake up one day and I'm like, hang on a minute, I felt it. Like I used to call this, it's like you saw the sight of the whale breaching, and then it's gone down. And I will say is the Leviathan is breached. I felt it. I know it's there. I know the answer is within my grasp. I can feel it and I can sense it. And then it's like, it's a case of nurturing it back up, like trying to interpret some of those feelings and impressions. And I've also got to trust my unconscious sometimes. So one of the things, when you look at my bookshelves, like we'll be jamming on some ideas with some of my team, and I pace around my office a lot. And then something will come up and I'll be drawn to a part of the bookshelf. And again, remember my books are random. So there's no organization. I'm drawn to a part of the bookshelf and there's the book, and I'm like, hang on a minute, this is it. I'll pull it up. And I've called that the basically the anti-library, but I've actually called my little persona who draws me to the right book, I call him Umberto. So Umberto Eco, like Nassim Taleb had this idea of the anti-library, right? It is this sort of, you've got this library of books, and many of them are unread yet, but they're curated. Like I curate, this library isn't just random. Like even the unread books are there because I've researched the topic and I'm like, here's the top 10 books on this subject, and I'll put them out there. And when I need it, like I'll know I'll be drawn to it. Sometimes this book I've read, sometimes this book I've skimmed. Like when I bring a book into my library, I skim it and pull, oh, this is what it's got in there. So it gets me excited about the ideas in there. And then I'm drawn to it. So this idea, when something breaches, I try and get an impression of what it's telling me. So it's, oh, it feels like I have to go and read these books because that seems to be, now I need to go and look over there. So understanding how it bubbles up. So as much as the input is questions, so being able to speak to the unconscious is through questions, I've realized it speaks back in impressions and feelings.
Yeah.
Like
and intuition, or
the gut feeling, the intuition. So I've got much better at like listening to my gut.
Yeah, it's interesting. Last night, I was just looking at my notebook. Last night, I wrote down my question for my unconscious was, why take notes? And because I'm doing a workshop this week on note taking and wanted to process that. But what came in my dreams last night was like you say, it was a very strange impression, but it was like a flickering or a fluttering self like identity, almost like this film that's old, an old film that's bad or that's
Yeah.
fluttering, an insect with wings or something. And I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, but as I started writing this morning, it was like, oh, okay. Taking notes is also is a way of discovering yourself. It's a way of understanding what you're interested in and what stands out to you across a bunch of different books or videos or things that you watch or read. So that for me, that's just an example for me of like how this manifests. It's interesting to compare it. Let's back up a little bit to the work that you do. You do a lot of work with clients, right? Customers who are focused on innovation problems. Obviously, can't ask you to give away any like corporate secrets or anything, but what have you noticed about how does an innovation problem tend to present itself? When somebody comes to you and they're describing, okay, we have an innovation problem. They've somehow decided that they have an innovation challenge or problem. How do they typically present, how does that problem come framed? And then how do you go about thinking about that and maybe reframing, or how do you then proceed with your work?
Yeah, a lot of the time when a client's talking to us, they have we think we've got the problem with this. Like a lot of what we're doing now is companies going, all right, Gen AI. Okay, I got it. What do I do with it? How do I change my underwriting workflow? Right? How do I do that? How does Gen AI fit? Because at some level, they've gone, all right, get Gen AI, does content, does marketing, does that kind of stuff, can write emails for me. But people come to us and go, I think this the thing and it's going to help us over here. What we'll normally do is, all right, let's unpack that. Let's look at your underwriting process. Let's look at where you think. So we'll do a workshop and explore what we call like the possibility space around it. Because our job is to take something which is sometimes they're even telling us, I need help with this. So we had a client a decade ago now, it was a retail store, and they were like, I want to help our sales staff, and we want a digital whiteboard in the back so they can look at all their KPIs. And we were like, really? A digital whiteboard? Okay. Why do you want a digital whiteboard? Why do you think it's a digital whiteboard? It's all this data's coming in, they need visualizations of it. And it's like stepping back from the problem. Like interesting thing we found out was the way the store ran, it was very optimized. Like these sales rep had less than 2 minutes with breaks in between customers. And we were like, there is no chance they're going to the bathroom. They're not going and analyzing some digital whiteboard at the back of the store. This is not. We had to be able to think about, hang on a minute, can we actually give them a rapid fire, glanceable visualization on their phones so they can look as, oh, I'm doing this, that's my next best action, whatever, and be able to do it. They came to us with what they find as a defined problem, and we had to step back and go, what is the problem? What is the problem space? Problem finding, problem understanding, before we ever get to trying to problem solve.
Let's back up on that whiteboard thing for a second, because it sounds like they weren't even coming to you with a problem. They were coming to you with a solution to a problem.
Which is half the time they do. It's sometimes unsaid, but they have an idea what they want. So half my job, even in the sales process, is to unpack it enough that to get them to articulate what they think it is, and then be able to unpack it and go, hang on a minute, what happens if it's not that, right? Because most of the time it's faster horses. Like people are good at assuming they know what the solution is to a problem. We don't like information gaps. The level of client I work with, by the time they come to a consultant, they're like, I think we've got a sense of it. But this new level of like where we're brought in is companies who are like, I don't know what to do about this. And that's when we get a little bit more strategic. So this is where actually we use a technique called adjacent possible. So Stephen Johnson made it famous, but it's comes out of complexity research.
Yeah, it's Kaufman, right? Stuart Kaufman.
Yep, Stuart Kaufman. Thinking through it, right? I've basically operationalized a set of patterns which goes across macro signals, so we can understand the implications of these macro signals and what is the adjacent possibility which actually opens up. So we will help companies step back and go, all right, let's take this. generative AI. All
Mhm.
right, what does that actually do? So we look at the value chain, like this is what you do. We were working with a media company, and these large media companies were looking at this problem and going, hey, we need to play around with this. The writers were out on strike, the actors joined them, and they were
Mm.
like, but there's some really cool stuff happening with this generative AI. We think we need to do something with it. They sensed it, but I don't think they fully understand the implications. So we step them back and go, all right, let's actually look at your value chain. For this, you've got content, you've got development, you've got production, you've got distribution at a high level. And I worked with media industry clients back in the sort of 2007, 2008 timeframe when streaming was coming out there. And we were
Hmm.
going to them, your distribution is going to get decimated. And they were like,
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, it's fine. Like Netflix is just a new channel. We can actually get more money, more. So here's the IP. We're going to give it to Netflix and they're going to give us a new revenue stream. 5 years later, they're all scrambling to build their own streaming platforms because they've literally created that media competitor. They
Mm.
actually let it grow right in front of them. So we were talking to them and go, generative AI, just with what we had in May last year, say, we look at this. Production has been your moat. And it's got more and more expensive to get high dollar movies, the special effects, all of that. So that's really expensive. So that's been the reason there's only a handful of companies who can play in that space. This technology wipes out that moat. And we're already seeing the rise of YouTube and the content which the young generation are watching, the gaming platforms, and like this technology allows them to create movie level things very soon in a way which will just wipe out what you thought was your moat. You do something now, or the Jason Possible is going to play out. So this just got really cheap. So abundance, so we've got a pattern called abundance. Like when this thing gets cheap in a value chain, you're going to create new scarcities either side of it. So you should look at the scarcities to work out what you should do to be able to play in this space. Do you drive down and jump on? Or do you actually use one of these adjacent possible patterns to actually go, what is the first order, second order, third order? So mapping out those, that's how we help companies pay attention to whether it's a demographic shift, whether it's technology, playing that forward cheaper, faster, better. What does that do? What is the result of it? And then how does it affect your industry? And how does it bring down things like economic moats and competitive advantage?
Wow. Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about how you use visual frameworks in your process. Where do they come in? What would you say a visual framework is to you? What does it mean?
So, yeah, look, I've been playing with building frameworks for a long time. When you look at the classic toolkit of a consultant, they always have the 2x2s, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we have over time built up a handful of what I call framework atoms, which we use over and over again. But the 2x2 allows you to process information in a sort of multi-dimensional way, brings multiple variables, and you can see what the combination of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most famous frameworks I developed back in the sort of UX days was something called a persona grid. And instead of the 5 personas which people would model, I would go through every sort of what I call contextual behavioral dimension of the research from the ethnography. And I would narrow it down to what I thought of as 4 dimensions. And I'll do this multiple times and we'll test it out. And we'll create the 16 box, right? It's a 4x4 grid.
Mm.
And it's actually 2x2s, 2x2s. So we'll have 2 dimensions on one sort of x-axis, and then on y-axis there's 2 more dimensions which is mapped on. So it basically takes this 16 box, and then you create these personas, and it allows you to be able to see a much larger range of behavioral combinations, which we would try 3, 4, 5 different grids to be able to understand which one fits the data which we have. As we're doing
Mm.
clustering, and like this tool allowed us to be able to see it. And then we actually turned it into a dynamic tool, which was like, this is your personas today. Going back to that retail store, like these are the personas, 16 personas, which matched all the data. But these sales reps, which fit into these personas, what you want to do is move them down these dimensions. How do you turn somebody who's down at this bottom bottom left-hand corner, how do you move them through these dimensions? How do I improve behavioral dimension of this? How do I tap into that motivational dimension there? How do I change that? And we would turn those into solutions. Using a framework is a way of being able to understand the data set at one level. The way of using frameworks is we would take sort of all this ethnography and we'll go, what are the metaphors? What does this sort of feel like? Is there something similar we've seen before from another field? And this is where I started using what are called mental models, or what you have as visual frameworks. It's like, how would we model this? A lot of times at a digital agency, not only would we have to think about it in this framework, but then we'll visualize it, because then we can visualize it for the client to explain the space. So we would then look at, is this waves? One of the papers I wrote last year was looking at Carlota Perez, this technology disruption wave, which she mapped out as this curve. And I turned it into a series of tidal waves, which were hitting sort of the coast, from the coast all the way to middle America. So as technology comes along, her thing was like, there's three waves. So these big technology waves starts off as a technology. So that's the first sort of tsunami which hits. And it hits the coast first, right? So this idea, it hits Silicon Valley, then it starts working in. Following the technology wave, then you have this sort of business sort of wave which follows after it. When somebody works out how to create a business out of it, what's competitive advantage. So you have this business wave driving through. And the last one is when we make this a social wave, society wave, where we actually put the regulation, the like, how do we make it better? So taking that, we created them as three visual tidal waves hitting the coast, from the coast all the way to middle America, to go like early adopters to late adopters. So that visualization of waves allowed us to tell that story. So that's what I think of, like when I look at sort of your visual frameworks, to me, they're sort of thought starters for metaphors. How do we visualize this story? Then on the other side is like my sort of analytical toolkit a framework. There's this great work by Stanislaw Dehaene, who is a neuroscientist, and he's found that there's some common frameworks built into our brains. And there's a handful of them. There's something called a number line, which could also be a timeline.
What's his name again? Stanislaw
Dehaene. Number Sense, I think, is one of his books. The one which is How We Learn is his more recent book, which unpacks some of these different pieces he's looked at, from reading to math to now overall as learning. But he basically, we've got a number line, which can be used as a timeline. So our brain has this sort of concept where we can look at, this is larger than this, or this happened after this. Then there's a tree structure, which is natural in our brain. So we can put things and go, this divides into this, divides into this. So a tree structure. Then you've got another sort of framework in our brain, which is actually how we think about mapping space. So we've got this thing in our brain, which is what he calls place and grid cells. When we were mammals, there's a huge part of our cortex which actually mapped out the physical world. So they've seen it in rats after playing in mazes, like they can see in their brain, and they can actually see a literal, the structure of the maze and the different paths the rat went through as it's dreaming. And how these actually get mapped up is actually hexagons. So we actually have hexagonal maps in our brain, which actually were evolved to map out physical space. But now we've rolled them up into being able to map out abstract information. As we've evolved from low-level mammals to hominids, we have this neocortex, which has, to Jeff Hawking's model, we have thousands of these map-like structures which have turned into columns, which all can map out abstract information using a very similar visual spatial metaphor.
Wow.
So these are just some of the things which are hardwired in our brain. So I use that to be able to go, how do I tell a story? How do I map information so somebody can understand it? How do I use a metaphor to be able to visualize that story? To me, frameworks are hugely important, but I blur the line between sort of analytical frameworks, which helps me think, visual frameworks, which help me tell stories, and then this idea of thinking in mental models, which allows me to understand a little bit more about how I build a working model of a part of the world, which kind of can help me simulate what happens.
I guess you could say that science and innovation and new technology, new inventions, they're always ahead of language, right? We're always creating the thing before we have a name for it. That's part of the challenge in that world, isn't it?
Yeah, and visual is so much more powerful in that world, right? When you can't put a word to it, or you don't want to use a word because it's going to bring baggage, or you have to create a new word which nobody understands, like a visual sort of something which can be something which somebody gets, right? And oh, I understand the metaphor. Like doing that in a visual way, it allows them to connect. Oh, this is like this. Oh, I understand how waves work, right? And tidal waves or tsunamis and like coasts and how like you can use aspects of what people understand about the world already with visual metaphors to be able to convey deep, complex ideas.
Let's just take companies for a second. I know you work with a lot of large companies. Every company has to be adapting. The world's constantly changing. There's always a new technology. There's always going to be a next competitor, a next challenge. How do you think people in senior positions should be thinking about innovation? Because you've also got to run your current business, right? While you're looking toward the future. What do you think is a good way or a smart way for senior people to think about how and where innovation fits into their business system?
Look, I will say over the last 20 years, there are more leaders who understand that disruption is going to happen and the importance of true innovation. 20 years ago, when we were first starting out, innovation was a new product. Like they got the Procter and Gambles of the world. We have to come up with a new game. We have to new TV show. It was all very sort of product focused, and they got it. It's like a new revenue stream, BCG strategy. Like this is a cash cow. How do we create the thing which is new? I think because of everything, especially in the last decade, a lot of executives have gone through, right? So a lot of the boomer generation not only have gone through the dot-com crash to 2008 to COVID and now, so they've got a lot more experience. And even Gen X who are taking over from that, and even young millennials who are going into executive positions, like people are more aware that change is happening. But they still want the easy answer. Because I think a lot of work which we did when I was back in the KPMG, we ran an innovation lab which helped companies think about disruption. Like they would come in and they will go, all right, I get that there's a demographic shift happening, these millennials, right? They seem to be different kind of young customer. They seem to be doing things a little bit differently, enough that it was starting to affect their traditional sort of business model. So like talking about what is a new code, what is the new business model which takes advantage of it? There's a platform business model. Like this is a new structure. It works very differently than economies of scale. It's actually economies of networks, right? So teaching them about it and understanding like the young generation are leading the way and everybody else is following. So companies started playing around more with innovation labs, investing in technology, and building out these sort of different ways of thinking, new business models, new services, and like, how do I stay relevant? So Clayton Christensen's work on disruption is very well known. But this is where the nature of somebody is to over-index on the present and assume the future looks like the past. They can always see that faster horses. It's very hard for them to see a car. And what we've gone through in the last few years is, as much as like people are leaning into new technologies, they put too much weight in the fact that, oh, that started and didn't go anywhere. Oh, everybody was talking about Web3 a few years ago. Where's Web3? Can ignore that. Everybody was talking about metaverse. That's gone, right? Oh, AR. Google tried it with Google Glass. It's done, right? What they don't see is, as much as like we talk about the Gartner hype cycle and we talk about the trough of disillusionment and all of that, like they don't know how to pay attention to it. This is where Rita McGrath's work, inflection points, seeing around corners. You have to still pay attention to these technologies because it's like gradually and then suddenly. It's not when it pops and everybody's all excited about it. It's when it disappears and it goes underneath the public consciousness, because when it pops up again, it's going to look very different. And that's when true disruption comes. So what we've seen over the last few years is there's a lot of complacency where people are like, oh, we tried to do investing in Web3, didn't go anywhere. We tried investing in Metaverse, didn't go anywhere. Oh, now you're talking to me about Gen AI. It's like, all right, I get it. I've seen for the first time companies start stopping to think about innovation because they're like, first they're going, I get innovation, we do it all the time. Second, they're going, the innovators are constantly wrong, and let's just assume I know what the answer is going to be. So for the first time ever in the last 2 years, I've seen companies pull back. Again, it's the 2023 was a tough year for a lot of companies, like economic downshift, having to lay off people, scaling back. So it's innovation seems like a luxury in a world which they're like, I don't need innovators. I just need people to do things. I need to keep the tires on our current business. Like, oh, isn't it just digital transformation? So I feel like there's a whole bunch of leaders who think they get Gen AI, but are missing the larger change which is at play. So I
Well,
think we
yeah,
lulled into a sense of sort of security.
I think that's really interesting because if you go back to where most of the truly disruptive business innovations happened, it's usually after a downturn. People get laid off. People like after 2001, 9/11, all the dot-coms crashed, and that's where a lot of the new emerging stuff like Uber and Airbnb came out of people who were displaced, creative people who had suddenly time on their hands. And what's interesting about those things is that you're never going to get to Airbnb by trying to make a better hotel, to your point about faster horses. You're never
Yeah.
going to get to Uber by trying to make a better taxi service or trying to make a better car service or car rental service, or that these things don't come out of adding a technology to something that already exists. They come out of brand new combinations of things that just weren't imaginable before, like utilization of the Uber was started just by utilizing free time that
Like,
people had that they were already driving cars. And Airbnb came out of people just taking their spare room and renting it or renting their couch even. And how many of these things actually came out of homegrown initiatives from in big companies? You talk to people who are doing like innovate in the startup world who are doing innovation work, and you talk to people who are trying to do innovation in large companies. And one thing I hear from people is even though I have a job in a big company where we have billions and billions of dollars to work with, it's actually easier for me to innovate by quitting and going off on my own than having the big budget because the company has so many blind spots or bureaucracies or red tape or what have you. How many people could have created their innovation inside their big company and just left out of frustration to go start their startup because the company got in the way? The billions of dollars got in the way. How do you, let's say I'm in a big company, I want to get better at that. How can I be thinking about clearing the path? Let's say I do have innovators inside my company and I don't want to lose them. Do you have any thoughts? How can they clear the path for those people?
so
Or is it better just to wait and say, okay, let them quit, let them go out there, and then we'll spend $1 billion to buy them? We'll just scan the horizon for those kind of startups and buy them when we can.
I definitely think that's one strategy, right?
Mhm.
Companies have got it's at some level, it's a better use of the deep pockets. Let somebody else go and prove it. And when it's a thing, let's use the deep pockets. But look, there's only a handful of winners who get the best deal on that. Because once something's proven, it becomes really expensive and you're competing. And these days you're competing with the Googles, the Facebooks, the Metas, the Apples, like people with
Right.
much deeper pockets than these large enterprises. So if you're a bank, yeah, you've got a lot of money. If you're a top consulting company, you've got a lot of money compared to others, but competing against these tech giants is really hard, right? So at some level, if you've got some people who are about to go and do something, like, why don't just basically say, it's like, all right, part of the deal is we have an option to bring you back in if you succeed. We'll give you a little bit of funding. Like, instead of us paying for you and you employ, like being as an employee and all the rest of it, it's like, maybe one arm is to be able to invest in people's ideas when they want to go off and do something and bring them back in. If it doesn't work, they've learned a ton, and you'll bring them back in as now with a lot more knowledge. If they did work, then you've got an option to buy them. So that's a model which I think could be really interesting. I've seen a handful of companies do things like that. I do think that H3 models like Horizon 3, I've been part of one back in the day at Akamai, and it spun out, and like, it can move things forward. Like, trying to understand the value of innovation in your organization is more than just the results, because it allows everyone in the organization to find incremental innovation faster. It allows them to feel like they can go through this, right? So at some level, having some innovation capability isn't to say our capability is to come up with a new product, service, and a new business model, but having it means that everyone else who's working there can at least get some benefit out of these people. We train thousands and thousands of people at KPMG on design thinking, a new form of design thinking which we'd invented. That drove innovations. Like, they bought our digital agency, and one of the things that we did was we trained them on the way of how to think about the world and innovation through design thinking. There's a lot you can get from acquiring this level of talent. We worked with a large insurance company. Sort of the concept they wanted was, how do I need an entrepreneur who understands how large enterprises work, and I want to create a startup inside my enterprise. But, he tried like going, let me go and hire an entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, drop them in. Like, they get frustrated really quickly, right? Because large organizations. So how do you have somebody who understands regulation and red tape and can still innovate? So one of the things I've had to do, it wasn't my choice, was learn how to innovate with my hands tied behind my back. Both at KPMG and then at BCG, it's one of those things you learn to have to deal with the internal bureaucracy. So that's actually a skill in itself. That's how you keep organizations, that lifeblood, going a little bit longer. But some of the ideas is, maybe you should invest in somebody who's about to walk out the door. You should have a program which goes, look, if you're leaving to start something because you think you can't do it here, let's have a conversation on that way out, and let's see if we want to invest in it. Look, if HP had not just dismissed Woz when he came and said, I invented this computer when I was working for you, and I basically said, oh, good luck, kid, go and build $1 billion company, like, they just lost that talent. Like, you lose, these organizations currently are hemorrhaging some of the best innovation talent I've seen out on the market in decades, including Google, including Amazon, including Meta. Like, all of these companies are throwing a whole bunch of people out who, this is the most talented pool of people I've seen since the dot-com crash be out there on the market.
It's so interesting because to that point, I think the people who started Nest, they either came out of Apple or Google. I can't remember which, but then they ended up being acquired by Google. So Apple could have kept Nest, but they ended up giving it up to Google because of exactly what you're talking about, right?
Human AI, so the AI pin, Humane, that was a couple of folks out of Apple who went off and created this new modality for interacting. Like, whether it succeeds or not is probably not as important as the innovations that they've come up with for interacting with their AI device. Same thing with Rabbit, right? Like, we're having a really interesting period where these smart devices, these AI devices, which are finally breaking the back of just assuming everything just has to be built in a phone. I do believe at some level they're going to be brought back in if these companies are smart. back and incorporate it in the phone, incorporate it into small and small things like our watches, and eventually slowly disappear. So you're right. It's like getting smart about the right way to spend innovation dollars, because growth, competitive advantage, relevancy in the future, that has not suddenly gone away because you assume that you know how to innovate. Like, you are still going to be caught flat-footed. Google's going to be caught flat. Google was caught flat-footed. Let's face it.
And
OpenAI,
isn't that kind of what Microsoft was doing with OpenAI? And I don't know enough about it, but they invested in that early on, right?
they took a bigger bet on OpenAI, and the OpenAI was trying to integrate and have this founding was actually a number of different investors, but Microsoft realized early on that this was important, threw money behind it, and then followed it up with 10 billion, one of the largest investments ever at the start of last year. So they moved faster. Google at some level had probably better talent in some areas, like with DeepMind, and but they hadn't commercialized it. They hadn't, and they had to scramble to catch up.
mm.
Even the Googles of the world are being caught flat-footed. Amazon and Apple are trying to work out what to do here. And then what does that mean for these large organizations? The reason people bring me in is because they're not the Googles, they're not the Apples, they're not the Amazons who will eventually stumble their way into it. They're a little one tier down. They've got money, they want to do something, they don't know how to use it.
And then you got the other problem, which is when you can invest a lot of money in technology, it doesn't mean you have, just because you're looking for one thing doesn't mean you're going to find that thing. And you look at Xerox and Xerox Park, where they put all this money into investing in the office of the future, right? They actually did design the office of the future, but it ended up, all that invention ended up going elsewhere because they couldn't figure out what, I don't know. Like, why was it a Macintosh and not a Xerox Intosh?
Yeah, look, why did Microsoft and Apple reap the benefits of a huge investment, which was intended to create the future for Xerox, right?
Hmm.
It is one of we see that over and over again. Bell Labs created some of the best technology. Xerox PARC created not only the technology, but some of the best talent, which
Hmm.
went into the valley. They'd hired some of the best talent. Like, how do you not make those mistakes? Here's the thing. As an innovator, which has now spent more time out of startups and out of academia and more time in large enterprises, it's hard to be somebody who thinks differently. Innovators at some level, like, we make people uncomfortable because we can see things, we're contrarians, we can see a world which hasn't become yet, right? And the quote is, some people ask why, but I ask why not. And like, that sort of thinking makes it like there's a book out there, it's like Pirates in the Navy. Like, innovators are like pirates, which the Navy has brought on. But guess what? At some level, the Navy is always going to look down their nose at the pirates because we do things which look ridiculous and uncomfortable and risky. And like, you have to think very differently about ideas and spaces. And it's the companies who can find the space and the place to listen to these people, listen to us, do much better in the long run.
It's interesting as maybe you agree with this. I'm curious what you think, but it seems to me that AI is as disruptive a technology as the internet or as the graphical user interface. It's a complete game changer, totally disruptive. And part of the reason for that is because it levels the playing field where an individual or a very small team can now accomplish things that couldn't ever have been achieved before, except with a lot of resources, like you say. And the idea is like that more and more, if you have a laptop, you have practically a factory. You have all the things, whether it's a factory that can make an Iron Man type of Marvel movie, or it's a factory that can make cars or whatever. Really, AI is an extreme force multiplier for the small. What do you see? There is a certain degree to which size makes it harder to innovate. But yet, some companies like Amazon and Google, Microsoft seem to be doing a pretty good job of it.
So they have. So I do think a lot of these large companies have done a fairly decent job, and they compete against each other and jockey for these positions. But I do feel we're entering a new era, similar to you, right? To the rise of computers, the internet. So I look at these technologies which have the largest impact, and they enable something which augment our thinking, connect us in ways we've never been able to connect before. What I've been looking at with AI is we're finally at a point where this is not just thinking next to a machine. We're going to be able to think with a machine. And I think in the same way literacy changed our brains, it expanded our short-term memory, like literate society is different. I can see people who really immerse in AI are going to be able to think in ways which are very different. So this isn't the Pixar movie Wall-E and floating around and completely divorced, right? Yeah, there are going to be people who go, I don't have to think anymore. I don't have to create anymore because this AI does it. But the reality is the real stuff's going to start moving towards the people who go, this allows me to think in ways I couldn't think before. It allows
Yeah.
me to expand and think. And at the same time, AI's there. Something I've been wanting and looking at for at least a decade now is AR. So when I tried out the Vision Pro, I realized that the Apple had solved some of the key human experience problems which had plagued VR and devices previously. So I feel like we're not only entering spatial, getting past screens, really being able to step into a totally digitized world, which we know is there. It has been at our fingertips. Like we just are so close to it. I actually think it's augmenting our digital world, augmenting our
Mm.
physical world. I think there is going to be entertainment spaces and places where we're totally divorced. We're actually going to be unpacking Ready Player One, the movie. When you
Mm.
look at it from a human perspective, you realize that there's some things which are just not going to fly with how we think as humans, what we understand, what drives us from our innate motivations. Sort of, I think it's going to be more augmented. It's not just going to be floating windows of information. We keep always designing backwards, right? All these designers and UX professionals, they come out of school and they think that they know everything about user experience because they were taught it. They've missed that because we need a whole different kind of user experience paradigm to design truly in the spatial world.
Mm.
And this level of UX designers, 90% of them don't even see it. They
Mm.
think they can take what they understand about user experience and just move it forward. We need a whole new paradigm shift. I think that not only we're augmenting our minds, augmenting our intelligence, but we need to augment our experiences using this sort of concept. So going back to your question, I think we're going to see a lot more small entities bubbling up, and that is going to be far more disruptive. I think the Googles, Amazons of the world are going to struggle to keep the right talents because there is going to be an ability to do things on your own or in a small team or in a network, a distributed network of people coming together to solve problems, which we haven't had before. And we haven't had the economic models or the markets to be able to go to market on it. We've got all the pieces to be able to disrupt. Ever since I saw Kickstarter, I realized Kickstarter disrupts capital markets. A lot of investment from VC to angels to a lot of stuff investment banks do. The reality is it's taking a risk or investing in something which we don't know is possible yet. The idea of being able to, I already have 100,000 customers before I even put any money into actually building it, changes that sort of finance model. We've got a whole new capital markets model coming along. And I'm not sure capital markets sees it. I'm not sure Kickstarter sees it, but I can see the little elements which are already creating this new disruptive world which we're going to move into.
Let me just end on this note then, and with the last question. Let's say you were suddenly thrown out of work and you had yourself in a garage and a small team. Let's just say you were thrown into that position right now. What would you be looking at? What would you be thinking about? Where would you be aiming your laser beam searchlights? What would you be exploring?
First off, I would create something which is augmented So using all the right tools, so making sure everyone in our little group is using these tools and understands them and constantly keeping on top of them, right? So that'll be the first thing. The second thing I'd do is I'd look at what's opened up. So I think it was back in 2012, we finally saw the impacts of the internet and social media and Web 2. We started creating more information in 60 seconds than we can consume in a lifetime. So we had this post-knowledge economy blowing up in front of us. The idea of schools, information in the old form just completely blew away. We haven't seen the full impact. And with Gen AI, now this isn't just bloggers and social media, and now we're actually having everybody augmented intelligently through AI, being able to create even more ideas. So that we've gone exponential again in the information space. What's the new needs? To me, it's like, how do you curate it? Yeah, every time we create things which are overwhelming to us, we have curators. Google was the front door. If Yahoo was first, and then it became Google, the front door to the internet. Like, what is the new aggregator? What is the new curators? Because every time we have an explosion in something, we need new curators to help us pay attention to it.
Yeah, Microsoft Bing is a kind of a curator. TikTok, in a way, is a kind of a curator, right? It's a curator, could be an algorithm.
Yeah, so I'd be looking at what is going to curate and allow us to be able to be on top of this next information explosion. And then the other piece of this is we've got like 5.8 billion people on this planet access to the internet. How do we tap into all the talent which isn't traditional? Like, we have more Einsteins than ever before. So how do we tap into that network? I would create sort of an innovation network which brings all of this stuff together. I always believe the future is driven by people and ideas. How do we bring them together? So whether it's a coffee house in London or it's a Silicon Valley now on the internet, any place where you can bring people and ideas together. And that's what I love about what you're trying to do, Dave.
What a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Kes. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Fun conversation.
Thank you for joining us on The Art of the Possible. To learn more and discover your best next step, come visit us at schoolofthepossible.com. See you next time.
The reason I use my unconscious and incubation and tap into it and can process more information faster is because I've worked a method of working my unconscious and conscious together. What happens if we can use technology to not only extend our working memory, like a blackboard or a whiteboard or mural, how can we use it to be able to tap into our unconscious? Because guess what? The information is still coming into us through our senses.
Yeah.
We know sensory devices to be able to pull that in and externalize it, filter it, attention. So that thing tied together with our ability to create designs in a spatial way. So one of the things I'm thinking of is like, all right, we've got Centaur chess, which is person with a computer playing against somebody else with a computer. And that's interesting, but why are they playing chess? Because at some point, AI is getting better and better. Like a person in a really powerful AI, chess is going to be boring. What's the next complex game? I teased the idea of what does 10-dimensional chess look like? What happens if we can, through AI and spatial, be able to visualize things in a multi-dimensional where we can use our pattern matching ability to be able to sense things? How do we start thinking through that lens? Because I think when we start building things which push our intellectual capacity, we'll be able to do what literacy did for our short-term memory, our working memory, with technology in the next, very soon, I believe, in the next sort of era.
I think my brain maybe is a little bit more simplistic, but I go to where how kids who are raised with touch screens start trying to touch everything, like they touch windows and magazines and there's just an expectation built in that I should be able to touch and swipe anything. And so making everything touchable and swipeable is one piece. But then the other thing is, if everything's going to be smart, then everything should be able to hear us talk. So I picture the kid now being able to assume that you can talk to everything, like the clock, the the piece of wood, the vacuum cleaner. If we're going to give them intelligence, we need to give them senses too. We need to give them hands. We need to give them ears, noses, mouths. Like, what if everything could listen and could talk back and like the Alexa? I have to be careful
Mhm.
saying that word because I have one here. Thanks, Kes. I was really enjoyed it.
Great to see you. All right.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
All right. Take care.